He stopped to light her cigarette and said at that moment he knew that they should be together.
He was captivated by her.
The downstairs tenant heard noises upstairs, like a thump noise almost, wasn't sure what it was, and next thing she knows, the place is on fire.
She said, I could have stopped it. He'd still be alive if I would have stopped it.
She seized upon his vulnerability, just as she did with so many others.
Why? Why would you do this to her?
There was a lot of motive to kill her. She was the key witness in the investigation.
He had told his friends that he had been paid to do it. He could not resist her. He could not let go of her. Scott Dell was a very attractive person. He was very articulate, and he could also be really funny.
There was an aura about him that really was quite beautiful.
He was a very gentle person, soft-spoken, and he was super intelligent.
1988, Ontario, Canada. 36-year-old social worker Scott Dell is a quiet, introspective man looking for a fresh start in the small town of Killaloe.
Killaloe is it's a wonderful place. There's different communal farms back up in the hills. People that lived in the mountains were classified as hippies, and that's where we raised our kids, lived off-grid, and had our little animals and gardens.
Scott and his younger wife, Sherelle, settle in on a little farm to enjoy country life.
Right away, I had a kinship with Scott. Him and I spent hours talking.
Scott was accepted rather quickly as a very caring person, a very affectionate man.
But the 33-year-old Sherelle, on the other hand, seems a fish out of water in the small hippie town.
She was very like a movie actress. She changed her makeup. Then she experimented with different colored hair.
She looked like a porcelain doll. She would wear short skirts and fishnet stockings and high-heeled boots or shoes. And in the wintertime, she would wear a fur coat. And she would come to the village shopping dressed like that. We didn't know what to think of her.
But Sherelle turns on the charm, and soon the small community is eating out of her hand.
She was like this big queen and expected respect.
Like, she had this power over people that was unbelievably amazing. I think because she was so beautiful, people wanted to help her and take care of her.
Especially Scott.
He would just be the mother hen of the family. He was always catering to Cheryl. She'd say jump and he'd say how high.
The couple supplement their income on the farm by taking in foster children.
They did the ranch for children with special needs. There was a desire to try to do goodness.
They hired me to come and work for them in their home. There were 2 children that were placed there in their care, and then they had 3 children of their own.
But over time, Sherelle tires of the farm and her husband. Looking for excitement, she casts her spell on one of the other locals, who also becomes mesmerized by her charm and beauty.
Sherelle very quickly left Scott's relationship for an intimate relationship with a lady by the name of Gay Doherty.
She started dropping in on me and having conversations. And the next thing I knew, she was moving into my house with me.
When her and Gay Doherty met, it was lust at first sight. And Gay Doherty wanted to take care of her, just like Scott did. And Scott had said to Gay, you don't know what you're getting yourself into. She's totally consuming. She'll consume your life.
Despite what seems a huge betrayal, Scott still tries to salvage his marriage. He can't quite let go of Sherelle.
He really loved Cheryl, and all he wanted was the family to be intact, even to the point where he would accept Gay as Cheryl's lover, as long as she stayed within the family.
But Sherelle is determined to leave. She files for divorce and then drops a bombshell.
Sherelle Dell was accusing Scott of sexual inappropriateness with children in the home.
Scott was ordered by the courts to leave the home, to turn over the children to Sherelle. And
Police mount an investigation.
so Scott's reputation did take a significant hit within the small community of Killaloe. People hearing about these allegations would wonder about Scott's behavior.
But Scott's friends stay loyal, believing Sherelle has an ulterior motive.
Cheryl's motivation was to get sole custody of the kids, and she wanted the farm.
That allowed Sherelle to access funds for the care of the children. And so that gave her more money in her daily life.
Every time she told the story about the abuse towards herself and her children, it changed. So I eventually began to really disbelieve what she was telling me.
Fortunately for Scott, Gay is not the only one who doubts Sherelle's claims.
The more that the Children's Aid Society or the police investigated these allegations and actually followed the evidence, the more the truth came out.
The courts award custody to Scott.
It was a very strong position from the court about the fact that these allegations were false.
So Scott moved back to Killaloe. Sherelle was forced to leave and find other accommodations.
I realized Scott was a very deep, caring man, and that I had stepped into something that I regretted.
Gay also realizes that Sherelle's charm masks a darker side and decides to leave her. All alone now, Sherelle feels resentful of Scott.
In the fall of 1995, Sherelle was very angry that she no longer had control of the farm, the contents, and the child care associated to the children.
But she was very determined, so she wasn't finished yet. She was still determined that she was going to gain access of the children and the farm.
And in the summer of 1994, as the divorce is being finalized, it seems Sherelle will get her wish when Scott receives devastating news.
Scott was diagnosed with oral cancer, which was in his throat and moved to his lymph nodes.
Scott underwent surgery for the cancer as well as radiation.
And once Sherelle thought he was going to die, she didn't want the divorce any longer.
The couple remains separated, and to everyone's surprise, Scott beats the odds.
It had gone, his cancer was in remission. Scott was really happy.
Sherelle, on the other hand, is devastated.
All of a sudden we find out Scott's in remission, and Cheryl's not getting everything that she thought she was going to get handed to her.
Cheryl wanted him to die so she could have custody and the farm.
She didn't quit. She upped the ante.
Coming up, a mysterious death might be the result of natural causes.
I drove over to his place, and of course it's all taped off with yellow tape.
His family was very suspicious of the cause of death.
But when one more person dies, the community is shaken. Who will be next?
She says, she's going to take me out. I can't open my mouth. I'm dead.
December 1995, Killaloe, Ontario. Social worker Scott Dell was entranced by his wife Sherelle and completely devoted until she betrayed his trust by making false allegations against him. Now they are separated, but as he recovers from cancer, Sherelle reaches out to him.
Sherelle wanted Scott to come by her house. She had had this dream about the two of them reconciling, and that was really all he wanted. So Scott went to her home.
And after the visit, Scott Dell returns to the farm with hope in his heart. He has no idea it will be the last night of his life. December 29th, 1995. 3 days after Christmas, a friend shows up at Scott's house to take him on a shopping trip. But something seems awry.
She describes to us how she found the door ajar, went inside, and the house was cold. She shouted for Scott, no response, and she could hear a weird noise. This noise was a record player, the needle spinning, but not making contact.
The friend ventures upstairs where she makes a tragic discovery.
They found Scott in an upstairs bedroom believed to be his son's.
He had vomited and he was deceased laying on the floor.
I received a call from a woman who told me that Scott had died. And I thought, that's not possible. I drove over to his place, and of course it's all taped off with yellow tape.
Once officers were dispatched to the scene of Scott's death, they found Scott's body. They found a part bottle of wine. They found a wine glass that was partly filled with what was believed to be wine.
When investigators interview Sherelle, she reveals what seems like pertinent information about the days leading up to Scott's death.
She had told us that Scott had been suffering for some time with throat cancer and that he was expected to die any time.
The officers relayed this information to the coroner, who listed Scott's death as cancer-related.
Preparations are made to have Scott's body cremated at Sherelle's request, until Scott's family finds out.
His family was very suspicious of the cause of death. They were really adamant that a post-mortem examination be done. At the 11th hour, Scott was taken from the crematorium.
By the grace of God, it was holiday time, Christmas time, and the crematorium was closed.
In early January 1996, an autopsy is performed with surprising results.
It was discovered that Scott was in fact cancer-free and that he had died as a result of elevated levels of ethylene glycol. He had been poisoned with automotive antifreeze.
Detectives sit down for a second time with Sherelle. Is she trying to hide something?
Sherelle changed her story and said that Scott had committed suicide. And she validated this by saying that he was depressed, he was upset that his cancer had returned.
She suggested that he must have wanted to have killed himself.
Forensics determined that the wine bottle found at Scott's house on the night of his death contains antifreeze. Police believe this confirms Sherelle's theory that Scott was depressed and drinking alone.
So that sat with the officers in a way that was easy for them to accept that this was a suicide.
Not everyone agrees with the police findings.
Right away, when they were notified that Scott had died, his family suspected Cheryl of killing him.
But Sherelle doesn't seem to have a strong motive. The farm is mortgaged to the hilt. And it seems Scott may have had a real reason for depression. There had been no hope for reconciliation because Sherelle is in fact involved with another lover. A 39-year-old woman named Nancy Fillmore, whom she'd met before Scott's death.
In the spring of 1995, Sherelle responded to an ad in the Ottawa Citizen that had been placed by Nancy Fillmore. The two of them started a relationship, initially writing telephone calls, which developed into a more intimate relationship.
When Nancy Fillmore and Sherelle met each other, the very first weekend they had sex. Nancy didn't know how manipulative Sherelle could be.
Nancy, she came from the Maritimes. She lived in Ottawa. She was a very caring but open, trusting person, very naive.
Nancy, she's very book smart, but when it come to life skills, she was very innocent. I called her wet behind the ears because people could take advantage of her so easily.
Like Scott Dell and Gay Doherty before her, Nancy fell under the spell of Sherelle's charm.
Sherelle made Nancy feel good about herself. So Nancy fell in love with Sherelle, and Sherelle was able to manipulate Nancy into believing that there was a relationship for them.
Cheryl literally reeled in Nancy and sucked her dry. And it wasn't until Scott's death when Nancy everything changed.
Coming up, what does Nancy Fillmore know about Scott Dell's death?
For God's sakes, Nancy, if you've got something inside, just freaking say it.
What she initially told us was quite remarkable and difficult to fully believe.
In December of 1995, Scott Dell is found dead in his home after ingesting automotive antifreeze in an apparent suicide. Just a few months prior to his death, his estranged wife, Sherelle Dell, had moved in with 37-year-old Nancy Fillmore.
Scott was still playing somewhat of a role in Sherelle's life, and I think Nancy was probably jealous of that and didn't want to share this newfound love.
Scott and Sherelle were separated at this point, and Sherelle was in need of funds and a new home, making Nancy an attractive target for Sherelle.
Nancy came from a somewhat affluent family.
I believe the reason that Cheryl and Nancy became lovers is because Nancy had some money and Cheryl wanted to buy a house.
So Nancy gave her the money for the down payment. And I told Nancy, maybe you need to get some papers drawn up. Make sure your name is on that deed. She trusted. She says, no, Sherelle took care of everything.
Nancy also trusts everything Sherelle says about Scott. As she did with Gay Doherty, Sherelle claims she was a victim of an abusive marriage.
Sherelle told Nancy that Scott would starve the kids, that he would actually rape her, and that's when Nancy's demeanor really started to change because she was convinced that this man was horrible, an abuser.
Ironically, as time passed, it was Nancy who became the victim of Sherelle's own abuse.
I saw the bruises on her wrists. I said, what happened to you? Oh, she says, we got into an argument, and she says she held my hand so hard. She says that's how I got the bruising. You could see the fingerprints on her wrists. That's when I told her, get out. You gotta get out.
After Scott's death, things got even worse. Over time, Nancy's friends begin to suspect she's guarding a terrible secret.
The whole time I'm watching my friend just slowly falling apart. So one day, her and I decided to go fishing and watch the sunset. And she just started to cry and shake. And I said, for God's sakes, Nancy, if you've got something inside, just freaking say it. She said, I could have stopped it, Kim. He'd still be alive if I would have stopped it. And then she told me everything about what happened to Scott. And I told her, I don't want to be the only person that knows this. You've got to come forward. It's just the right thing to do.
Finally, in March of 1997, 2 years after Scott's death, Nancy goes to the Ontario Provincial Police.
Nancy Fillmore came to the office asking to speak with the detective. And she was noticeably upset, somewhat agitated.
Nancy Fillmore tells us that Sherelle had kicked Nancy out of the house, basically, and kept Nancy's property in the house. So Nancy was upset, she was angry, and she wanted her things back.
Nancy eventually reveals the thing that's been preying on her mind, and it's nothing less than a bombshell.
Nancy revealed about the murder of Scott Dell, and she revealed how it happened.
Nancy gives the detectives a full statement about what sounds like a far-fetched plot to kill Scott when he recovered from cancer. She says it began back in December 1995, when Sherelle told Scott that she wanted to reconcile and that she had a gift for him, a bottle of wine.
Nancy Fillmore tells us that, in fact, it was a mixture of antifreeze or ethylene glycol and wine. And Sherelle had indicated to him that if he drank this while the two of them were talking throughout the night, that it may lead to some resolution. Some way for them to get back together.
Scott was so interested in having that conversation with Sherelle because it was about their potential reconciliation.
That night, the two of them start talking on the telephone, and they talk about their children, they talk about where the relationship is going to go.
Nancy told us that Scott listened to music that he and Sherelle had enjoyed and started to consume the wine, the mixture of wine and ethylene glycol.
According to Nancy, Sherelle keeps Scott on the phone for hours as he drinks the wine. She knows that he doesn't have the ability to taste and will never be able to detect the poison.
When Scott underwent surgery for the cancer, as a result of that, he lost any ability to taste.
She noticed at one point when they were talking on the phone that his voice was going hoarse. That's one of the reasons why Sherelle would keep him on the phone such a long time. She could hear what was going on, and then in her mind, the poison had done its job.
She doesn't want to put herself at the scene. She's very ingenious, very innovative in her ability to be able to keep herself at arm's length, yet still control a situation. And that's exactly what she was doing that last night of Scott Dell's life.
The whole thing was so unbelievable. Cheryl killed him.
Is Nancy telling the truth, and Scott's death was a murder masterminded by Sherelle?
Nancy told me she was sitting there listening to that phone call of Cheryl telling Scott, "You're my angel. Just take another sip."
Or is Nancy herself involved in the murder?
Nancy Fillmore told us that she was the one that picked up the ethylene glycol at Walmart.
She said she also purchased the bottle of wine at the Killaloe liquor store that was used to make the mixture.
Nancy Fillmore has just told Ontario investigators that she was a witness to the cold and calculating murder of Scott Dell 2 years earlier.
Nancy had the fear in her so bad that she couldn't do anything about it. She said, "I watched her mix the wine with antifreeze in the kitchen. This would never happen if I didn't buy the wine. Why did I not say no to Cheryl?"
Is Nancy a reluctant witness or a participant in the murder?
It would have been easy to discard what she was saying because of the way she was presenting it, because of her anxiety. But she was presenting, in part, a lot of serious allegations.
If what Nancy said was true, it would mean Scott's death was not a suicide, but a calculated homicide masterminded by Sherelle. Or Nancy could be a scorned lover who killed her rival for Sherrell's affections.
We were taking this information and trying to make an assessment on Nancy's credibility. It's not very often you have someone who is involved in a murder investigation show up at your door and just start talking about a homicide.
Ontario police get a full video statement from Nancy and proceed to investigate her allegations. But if what she says is true, there might be a target on her back.
We told Nancy that we would prefer if she left Killaloe. She was our main witness in the investigation. Everything hinged upon her information and the evidence that flowed from that. So we were concerned for her safety, and we wanted her to move.
She says, Kim, I'm not going to make it to trial. She's going to take me out. I'm dead.
Nancy was very afraid of Sherrell, and she was concerned for her own safety. But she was adamant that she was staying because she wanted to get her property back from Sherrell's house.
She's afraid for her life. She really feared. She was scared.
Nancy refuses to move away until she gets her belongings back from Sherrell. She waits anxiously for the results of the investigation. But in mid-August, Nancy's worst fears come to pass.
Around midnight, I was told that there was a significant active house fire at the residence of Nancy Fillmore in Killaloe, and that it was believed that Nancy Fillmore was inside the home.
The downstairs tenant heard noises upstairs, like a thump noise almost, wasn't sure what it was, and next thing she knows, the place is on fire.
Somebody came up and said to me, "Holy man, Kim, there's a big fire in Killaloe." And I knew. I just knew.
Firefighters enter the burning building and find Nancy Fillmore's lifeless body inside.
The cause of death for her was smoke ingestion.
I was heartbroken. We had been charged with the responsibility of investigating Scott's death, and part of that responsibility was to look after the witnesses that were involved in that investigation.
To detectives, Nancy's death is highly suspicious and gives weight to her statement regarding who was behind Scott Dell's death.
The first person in my mind was Sherrell Dell. Sherrell Dell is responsible.
Nancy's friends feel the same.
All I wanted to say was, why? Why would you do this to her? I still ask why. Because all Nancy did was love, and she was killed for loving someone.
Sherrell is under suspicion for 2 murders now, but she has an alibi for Nancy's death, and there is little evidence to indicate she was the one who started the fire.
There was a lot of motive to kill Nancy. She was the key witness in the Scott Dell homicide investigation.
Sherrell wanted Nancy out of the picture because Nancy was talking about the murder of Scott Dell, and Sherrell was very aware of that.
The detectives canvass Killaloe looking for leads and come across the name of a suspect with a strong motive.
During the spring and summer of 1997, Sherrell developed a relationship with a young male who was 16 years old at that time, Brent Crawford.
Brent Crawford was a bit of a loner, and he was just hanging around in the village of Killaloe.
Brent Crawford may be underaged, but he is a frequent guest at Sherrell's home.
Witnesses believe that he was sexually attracted to Sherrell.
The teenager was bragging to his friends about having sex with Sherrell Dell. He thought he had died and gone to heaven.
Had the 16-year-old been manipulated by Sherrell to target Nancy?
There was not one occasion, but multiple occasions where Brent was seen or witnessed to be harassing or in the vicinity of Nancy Fillmore's home leading up to her death. There was a number of reasons for us to be concerned that Sherelle Dell and Brent Crawford had conspired to murder Nancy Fillmore.
Apparently, he had told his friends that he had been paid to do it.
We attempted to interview Brent about his involvement in the death of Nancy Fillmore. Brent was having no part of us. In fact, he became very angry with us and left the location of the interview.
Not the actions of an innocent man. Investigators feel that Brent is their prime suspect, but there is little evidence against him. And soon, they hear news that could prevent them from ever giving Nancy justice.
We learned that Brent was on his way traveling out west. The heat was on Brent, so he was trying to get out of Ontario.
Coming up, police take a huge risk to break the case.
We incorporated the use of an undercover officer. We had a wiretap set up.
It just makes me sick. Those 2 deaths could have been stopped. And how this woman has so much control over people boggles my mind.
August 1997, Killaloe, Ontario. Nancy Fillmore, a former lover of Sherelle Dell's and key witness in the Scott Dell murder case, has tragically died in a house fire. And now police are zeroing in on a prime suspect, Brent Crawford.
They already had a good idea of what transpired, but they need a confession from Brent.
Only 16. Had Brent Crawford been an easy target for Sherelle Dell's MO of sexual manipulation?
We had information that Sherelle and Brent were intimate, and as things unfolded, that was Sherelle's typical modus operandi, to manipulate people through sexual means, to get them to do what she wanted.
Sherelle had multiple partners, both male and female, and she had no problems whatsoever using her sexuality to get attention and also to establish connection with other people.
It had been sexual attraction that had placed Nancy Fillmore at risk by pulling her into Sherelle's orbit, causing her lapse in moral judgment, for which she could never forgive herself.
She had this secret, and that's the part that near made her go nuts. She was devastated. It was like the walls just went boom, 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 boom. You know, she literally fell apart.
And when she finally did go to the police, she went through every day being afraid that Sherelle would do something to her.
But Sherelle had been clever. Instead of striking out at Nancy directly, police believe she used Brent to do her dirty work.
When Sherelle gets her teenage lover to kill somebody, it's another way for her to get power. So she's not only getting what she wants, which is the death of this person that she's ordered to be killed, but reaffirming to herself that she can manipulate people into doing whatever she wants.
And just as Sherelle had used Brent to kill Nancy, she used Nancy to help kill Scott, while staying at arm's length from the actual crime and leaving little evidence.
She had told him that he was to drink this bottle of wine. He was to visualize and try to meditate on what their future would be. And that was, again, so indicative of Sherelle. She's away from Scott. She's at her home in Boland Street. She's hands off, but still controlling.
Cheryl is cult-like in the sense that she's very much like Charlie Manson. Charlie was responsible for a lot of damage and a lot of death, but he was not the one who ever did it. And in that sense, Cheryl is the exact same way. She may be the mastermind, she may be the manipulator, but never the one who actually killed the individual.
And no one would have been the wiser had Nancy not given a full statement to the police. Tragically, Nancy herself is now a victim, and police have little evidence to bring Sherelle to justice for her murder. In a Hail Mary move, they enlist the assistance of an undercover police officer. Using a tactic common in Canada, the officer meets up with Brent, posing as a crime boss.
The undercover police officer kind of put himself off as a criminal, and that he was looking for like-minded people who could assist him in committing crimes.
The plan works.
Brent confessed to him within a very short time of killing Nancy Fillmore. We had a wiretap set up where he confessed on tape to this undercover police officer.
It was discovered that he had broken in and knocked the candles over.
That young man went in there, bopped her on the head. She loved candles, so there's candles everywhere, eh? And knocked over a candle, barricaded the door so she couldn't get out, and went out the bathroom window for $300 in cash and a bike from Sherelle.
With that information, we got a warrant to arrest him for the murder of Nancy Fillmore.
Police focus on building a double homicide case against Sherelle. They strike gold when they canvass the community.
In the summer of 1995 and early fall, she had taken a dog to a local veterinarian. During that visit, she had conversation with the doctor who told her what common effects were of an animal ingesting ethylene glycol. Later in the fall of 1995, she made a call to poison control in Ottawa, and Sherelle was looking for more information on the effects of ethylene glycol or antifreeze on people.
It's damning evidence.
It just makes me sick. Those 2 deaths could have been stopped or prevented. And how this woman has so much control over people boggles my mind.
Sherelle is arrested on homicide charges for Scott's murder in December 1997.
Personally, I thought, great.
I have to say that investigating that homicide was the highlight of my career.
In the interview room, police discover firsthand just how manipulative Sherelle can be.
The first time that I met with Sherelle Dell, she was very flirtatious, very flamboyant.
How do you protect yourself from someone like Sherelle Dell? When they're magnetic and angelic and attractive like Sherelle Dell, it's hard, and sometimes you just can't protect yourselves until it's too late.
Coming up, has Sherelle been calculating enough to get away with murder?
the world to see. They saw a sociopathic liar. They saw a manipulator. They saw a con artist.
She took my friend's life. I'd spit in her face. I have nothing good to say about her.
November 2000, Pembroke, Ontario. Sherelle Dell stands trial for the murder of her husband, Scott Dell, 5 years earlier by lacing his wine with antifreeze. The defense argues that Sherelle was simply trying to counsel Scott on the night of his death.
Her claims were that Scott had cancer and that Scott killed himself and that she was trying to talk him out of it.
The prosecution argues Sherelle was on the phone with Scott for 9 hours because she wanted to distract him while he slowly succumbed to the wine she had poisoned.
Whether you believe Scott was visualizing, meditating, or just having a conversation with Sherelle, it all came back to the potential of him reconciling and reuniting with Sherelle. That's why she was able to convince him to drink that bottle of wine, and that's why eventually he was murdered by Sherelle.
She truly does seem to treat people as objects in terms of her willingness to plan and kill and literally talk her husband through his death.
For Sherelle, gaining control of the farm was more important than Scott's life.
All along, Sherelle was focused on that matrimonial home, and when Scott was murdered, Sherelle realized that there was very little, if any, equity left in the farm, and so she actually removed all of the matrimonial contents and then falsely reported them stolen. So not only could she gain the contents for her own use, but she wanted to try to gain the insurance money as well. And she wanted control over those children so that she could get the welfare checks that came along with it.
But while Sherelle's motive remains clear, the case against her is circumstantial until a new witness steps forward. A fellow inmate of Sherelle's, and what she says confirms everything that Nancy Fillmore told police about how Scott was killed.
When they brought the woman in to testify in the trial against Sherelle Dell, the woman didn't want to come to trial. And so that was one of the arguments of the Crown at the time. Your Honor, this woman has nothing to gain. And she told the entire testimony of how Sherelle said that she killed her husband.
Sherelle Dell would use her charisma to lead people to believe that there was an opportunity for a physical relationship.
It was laid out for the world to see. They saw a sociopathic liar. They saw a manipulator. They saw a con artist.
A jury agrees. They find Sherelle guilty of first-degree murder for Scott's death, and she is sentenced to 25 years to life on January 26, 2001. Then, Brent Crawford goes to trial for Nancy Fillmore's murder.
Brent was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to 10 years in prison as a young person. With the death of Nancy Fillmore, Sherelle was charged with first-degree murder and convicted of intimidation of a witness. At the time in Canada, you couldn't be convicted and sentenced to 2 life sentences.
Where's the justice for Nancy? She murdered my friend and got only 5 years. That's wrong. It's wrong.
Cheryl truly is, she's a con artist, but she's also a psychopath. She has no empathy and she takes what she wants.
But she is one dangerous psychopath who at least remains in prison today and for the foreseeable future.
She took my friend's life. I'd spit in her face. I have nothing good to say about her. No.
Sherelle was able to have the same level of intoxicating manipulation to seduce Scott, Gay Doherty, and Nancy Fillmore and cause them to act to the extreme on her behalf.
For those who knew Scott, there are only good things to say about him. he paid the ultimate sacrifice for love.
Scott Dell was one of my closest friends. Sherelle had so much power over Scott because he gave it to her. He could not resist her. He could not let go of her. And I believe that if he could speak to her after dying, he would forgive her for being so manipulative.
Scott was a smart man. He was a kind man. He was an ethical man. Our only flaw that we could find with Scott was his undying love for Sherelle.